The pounding on my front door at 7 in the morning didn't an oppose. T just wake me up. It felt like it was trying to splinter the very oak my grandfather planed by hand 60 years ago, and when I stumbled out there in my boxers and a faded t-shirt, squinting against that harsh East Texas sun, I wasn't an oppose. T greeted by a neighbor needing to borrow a jumper cable or a delivery guy with a package. No, I was staring at the business end of 2 polished badges and the most punchable, smug expression I've ever seen on a human being, which belonged to a woman named Diane Sterling, the self-appointed queen of the High Ridge Homeowners Association, standing there with her arms crossed over a designer blazer as if she personally owned the air I was breathing, while the 2 officers behind her looked like they'd rather be anywhere else on God's green earth than standing on my porch over a, end quote, swimming pool dispute, end quote. And before I could even get a, end quote, morning, end quote, out of my mouth, Diane points a manicured finger toward the back of my property and tells the officers, end quote, there he is, that's the man who's been illegally barricading a community asset and denying tax-paying residents their right to the water, end quote. And I just stood there for a second, my brain trying to process the sheer, unadulterated gall of this woman calling a pool my family built before she was even born a, end quote, community asset, end quote, because you see, I'm Caleb Thorne, and I just moved back to Thorne Creek Ranch a few months prior after a decade of burning my soul out in the corporate litigation pits of Chicago, thinking I was coming home to find some peace, some quiet, and maybe a little bit of that old dirt-under-the-fingernail satisfaction my dad always talked about. But I didn't into oppose. T realized that in the time I'd been gone, the sleepy little town had been swallowed up by these cookie-cutter subdivisions that spread like a rash, and apparently, the HOA that governed those suburbs thought their jurisdiction didn't and oppose. T stopped at the sidewalk. They thought they could just reach out and grab a piece of history because it looked good on a brochure. Now, to understand why I was ready to go to war over a hole in the ground filled with water, you have to understand that this ISN and oppose. T just a pool. It's a blue-tiled miracle that my grandfather, Elias, dug out of the stubborn Texas clay back in the summer of 1962 when he didn't an oppose. T have 2 nickels to rub together, but he had plenty of pride, and he wanted his kids to have something the local country club wouldn't oppose. T Lynn, quote, folks like us, in quote, touch, so he spent every evening after work, for a year with a shovel and a borrowed backhoe, mixing the concrete in a rusty wheelbarrow and hand-laying every single sky blue tile one by one. And I can still remember him sitting on the edge of that pool when I was a kid, his skin like worn leather and his hands smelling of pine sap and chlorine, telling me that as long as we kept the water clear and the tiles tight, the Thorne family would always have a place where the world couldn't and oppose. T reach us, and after my dad passed away and the ranch sat empty for a few years, the pool had started to surrender to the elements, gathering oak leaves and turning a murky, sad shade of forest green. But the first thing I did when I quit my firm and hauled my boxes back home was buy a heavy-duty scrub brush and a pallet of salt. And I spent 3 weeks on my hands and knees under that blistering sun, scrubbing away 5 years of neglect until that blue shimmer came back to life. And it felt like I was washing away the stress of every billable hour and every soul-crushing deposition I'd ever taken. So when Diane Sterling showed up 2 weeks after I finished, leaning over my fence with a clipboard and telling me I needed to, end quote, remove the unauthorized locks from the community gate, end quote, I didn't an oppose. TJC, a nosy neighbor, I saw a thief trying to steal the only thing that made me feel like I was finally home. The cops, to their credit, looked skeptical when I pulled my deed out of the old metal filing cabinet in the den. A document yellowed with age and signed by a county clerk who's probably been in the ground for 30 years. And I walked them out to the property line where the manicured, lime-green grass of the High Ridge subdivision hits the wild, unbothered brush of the Thorne Ranch. And I showed them the rusted iron survey stakes that clearly marked where my world ended and theirs began, and I told the taller officer, a guy with a tired face who looked like he'd dealt with Diane's, end quote, emergencies, end quote, before, that if Mrs. Sterling didn't an oppose, to get her heels off my gravel in the next 30 seconds, I'd be filing a formal trespassing charge and a harassment suit that would make her HOA dues look like pocket change, and Diane just huffed, her face turning this spectacular shade of frantic purple as she screeched about, end quote, historical usage, end quote, and end quote, implied easements, end quote. Claiming that because some of the older residents used to swim there back in the 80s when my dad was feeling neighborly, the pool now belonged to the collective. And as she stomped back to her SUV, kicking up dust and shouting about how this wasn't Oppos, I realized that I wasn't Oppos. Just dealing with a bossy neighbor, I was dealing with a woman who had promised something she didn't in Oppos. Owned to a lot of people, and she was too deep in the lie to back out now. I started doing some digging of my own, and it turns out the, end quote, High Ridge Phase 3 expansion, end quote, wasn't Oppos. Just about building more houses. It was a multi-million-dollar deal involving a massive investment group out of Dallas, and in all their glossy, high-end marketing materials, the ones they sent to potential buyers and big-time investors, there it was right in the center of the, end quote, amenities and recreation, end quote, section, a beautiful high-definition photo of my pool, taken from a drone, no doubt, labeled as the, end quote, Historic Heritage Club and Aquatic Center, end quote, and my blood didn't in Oppos. Just boil. It turned into steam because Diane hadn't in Oppos. Just made a mistake. She'd sold my property as the crown jewel of her development project to inflate the property values and secure the funding, and she figured that end quote, burned out city lawyer, end quote, like me would either be too tired to fight or too broke to hold out against the HOA's legal machine. But what she didn't in Oppos, was that while I was in Chicago, my specialty was in Oppos. Just contract law. It was forensic real estate litigation. I was the guy firms hired to find the skeletons in the basement of multi-billion-dollar land deals, and Diane had just handed me a shovel. The next week was a psychological masterclass in suburban warfare, with Diane sending, end quote, compliance officers, end quote, to my gate every single day to tape bright orange notices about, end quote, unauthorized fencing, end quote, aesthetic violations, end quote, and my personal favorite, end quote, failure to provide lifeguard access to a public waterway, end quote. And every time I just walked down there with a pair of scissors, snipped the zip ties, and dropped the notices into a pile in the middle of my driveway like I was building a bonfire of stupidity. But the real escalation happened on a Saturday morning when I came outside to find a construction crew trying to dismantle my perimeter fence, claiming they had end quote, work order from the association, end quote, to install an electronic key fob gate for the residents. And I didn't in Oppos. I didn't in Oppos. Scream. I just walked out there with my phone on record and a copy of the 1994 County Planning Act that explicitly stated that Thorn Ranch was end quote, non-conforming, grandfathered agricultural parcel, end quote, exempt from any and all residential association bylaws. And I told the foreman that if his saw touched my wood, I'd have the sheriff out there for felony property damage before the blade stopped spinning. And those poor guys, who were just doing what they were told, looked at Diane, who was standing across the street in her, end quote, I'm in charge, end quote, sunglasses, and then looked at me, saw the look in my eyes that said I had nothing but time and a very deep bank account, and they packed up their truck and left within 5 minutes. That was the moment Diane realized she couldn't into Oppos bully me, so she tried to turn the community against me. And I started seeing these posts on the neighborhood Facebook group about the, end quote, selfish newcomer, end quote, who was, end quote, stealing the children's summer, end quote, and, end quote, devaluing everyone in Oppos, homes, end quote, by keeping the heritage pool all to himself. And I'd be lying if I said it didn't into Oppos. Sting a little bit when I'd go into the local hardware store and see people I'd known since I was a kid, looking away or whispering as I passed. But then I got a visit from an old friend of my dad's, a guy named Miller who'd been the county surveyor for 40 years before retiring to a quiet life of fishing and complaining about the weather. And Miller sat down on my porch with a cold beer and a tattered, coffee-stained leather folder. And he told me that back in the late 90s, when the first developer bought the land that became High Ridge, Diane's father, who was the developer at the time, had tried to be him to, end quote, adjust, end quote, the survey lines to include the Thorn Pool, because they knew the ranch was the only place with a natural spring-fed water line that could keep a pool that size filled for cheap, and Miller had refused. But he suspected that when he retired, they just waited for a less honest surveyor to come along and, end quote, lose, end quote, the original maps in the county transition to digital records. That was the smoking gun I needed. and I spent the next 72 hours in the basement of the county records office, fueled by black coffee and a burning desire for total, scorched earth vindication, and I didn't into oppos. Just find them apps. I found a series of emails and, in quote, consulting fee, in quote, invoices from the HOA's private accounts, which I managed to subpoena through a friendly contact in the Deed at A and Oppos office who owed me a favor from our law school days. And the paper trail was uglier than a Texas sinkhole, showing that Diane and two other board members have been funneling, in quote, maintenance fees, in quote, from the residents into a private shell company for 3 years, claiming they were, in quote, upgrading the community pool, in quote, that they didn't into oppos even own, and they'd use that money to fund their own vacations, luxury car leases, and even a kitchen remodel for Diane's house, all while telling the neighbors that the, and quote, legal battle with the Thorne estate, in quote, was what was, draining the association and oppos as coffers. The night of the emergency HOA meeting was a sweltering Tuesday, and the community center was packed to the rafters with angry residents, half of them ready to lynch me for, in quote, theft, in quote, and the other half just confused about why their dues had doubled in 12 months, and Diane stood up at that podium, looking every bit the victim, talking about how, in quote, we all have to make sacrifices for the integrity of our neighborhood, in quote, and how, in quote, Mr. Thorne's refusal to cooperate is a slap in the face to our shared values, in quote, and she was just about to call for a vote to authorize a, in quote, forced eminent domain seizure, in quote, of my backyard, which ISN and oppos, even a real thing a private HOA can do, but she was counting on them not knowing that. When I walked through the back doors with a stack of manila envelopes and a portable projector I'd borrowed from the library, I didn't in oppos. Asked for permission to speak. I just walked up to the front, plugged my laptop into their system, and the first image that hit the screen was an oppos, a map or a deed. It was the photo of Diane Sterling's brand new Italian marble kitchen countertops alongside the invoice for, in quote, Thorne pool tile restoration, in quote, that the HOA had paid for 6 months ago, and you could have heard a pin drop in that room as the realization started to sink in, and for the next 20 minutes I didn't, and oppos, give a speech. I gave a closing argument, laying out the fraud, the fake surveys, the drones that had trespassed on my property, and the fact that every single person in that room had been paying for a, in quote, community asset, in quote, that was actually just a line item in Diane's personal slush fund, and I watched Diane's face go from smug to pale to a terrifying, hollow white as the crowd turned from a mob into a jury, and the screaming didn't end oppos. Start until I showed the final slide. The one with the Dallas Investment Group's contract that proved Diane was planning to sell the, in quote, recreational rights, in quote, of the pool to a private swim club once she'd successfully stolen it from me, effectively cutting the neighborhood residents out of the very pool they were paying to, in quote, maintain, in quote. The aftermath was like a slow-motion explosion. Diane was forced to resign that night, and within 48 hours, the sheriff's department was back at her house, but this time they weren't in oppos. There to harass a homeowner. They were there with a warrant for wire fraud and embezzlement, and the High Ridge HOA essentially dissolved under the weight of a dozen class action lawsuits from the residents who wanted their money back. But the weirdest part of it all was and oppos. The legal victory, or the, in quote, I told you so in oppos, in quote. It was what happened to the pool, because once the noise died down and the, in quote, phase 3 expansion, in quote, went into foreclosure, I looked out at that water and realized that my grandfather had built it to be a place for people to be happy, not a battleground for a lawyer and a thief, so I didn't in oppos. Keep the gates locked forever. I ended up tearing down that ugly chain-link fence Diane had hated so much and replaced it with a beautiful, low-slung stone wall with a simple iron gate, and I put a sign on it that said, in quote, Thorne Spring, private property, in quote, but underneath in smaller letters it said, in quote, neighbors welcome on Saturdays, bring your own towel, and leave the clipboards at home, in quote. And now on hot July afternoons, I sit on my porch and listen to the sound of kids splashing and neighbors actually talking to each other instead of gossiping through a screen, and sometimes I see the new HOA board members, the ones who actually care about the neighborhood, sitting by the water, looking a little bit sheepish, but mostly just grateful that the war is over, but I still keep my grandfather's old scrub brush in the shed, just in case anyone gets the idea that they own the dirt under my feet. The thing is, I'm still not sure if I did the thing by letting them back in after they all turn on me. And some nights I sit out there alone, looking at the blue tiles shimmering under the Texas stars, and I wonder if I've just invited a new kind of trouble into my life, or if this is winning actually looks like. But then I think about Diane Sterling sitting in a cramped apartment waiting for her court date, and I realize that the best way to defend a legacy, ISN and oppos, just to fight for it, but to make sure it's worth fighting for in the first place. And I think my grandfather would have liked the noise of the kids better than the silence of a lawyer in oppos. This office anyway, but what do you guys think? Did I cave too easily by opening the gate to a community that tried to help a fraudster steal my home? Or is life too short to hold a grudge against people who were just being lied to by a pro? Drop a comment and tell me if you would have kept the gates locked, or if you think a little bit of grace is the best way to end a neighborhood war. And if you've ever had an HOA try to pull a stunt like this on you, I want to hear the gory details, because trust me, after what I went through, nothing surprises me anymore.